I'm ready to go? Okay, I can hear myself loud and clear. Good morning, everyone. My name is Brendan Vaughan. I am the editor-in-chief of Fast Company. I am really pleased to be here this morning with Duncan Crabtree Ireland. Most of you probably know who Duncan is. Duncan became a pretty significant public figure last year during the Hollywood strikes, but just in case you don't, he is the National Executive Director and the Chief Negotiator for SAG-AFTRA, the unions representing the creative community in Hollywood. I obsessively, as the editor of Fast Company, we covered the strike. I followed it because I'm fascinated with the issues at hand. I'm not going to assume that everybody was following it as closely. So let's spend just a few minutes going over what happened over those 118 days, the longest strike in 4 decades in the industry. The work stoppage, the impact that it had on people, but most importantly, to kick things off, the issues that led up to it, including but not limited to AI.
Yeah, I think it's clear that one of the most important issues in this entire process was AI and its implications for human creativity and the role of people like actors, but also writers, directors, other creative talent, and crew in the entertainment industry. And so that was an issue. We had a detailed proposal on AI on day one of negotiations on June 7th of last year. It was the last issue resolved out of all the issues on day 118 of the strike in November. And so you really can't overstate how significant AI was as part of that negotiation process, how difficult it was to achieve what we achieved, and really ultimately, that was only done with the direct involvement of the CEOs of the major studios and streamers. It became clear to me during the early days of negotiation that was probably going to be the case, and it did turn out to be the case. Ultimately, having direct conversations with them was the only way to get this strike resolved and get a deal reached. And it wasn't only AI, of course. There were other big issues too, including the impact streaming has had on the film and television industry, especially from the point of view of actors who I represent. The way this business has changed over the last 10 years due to the streaming business model, it's hard to overstate it. And to simplify it so that we're all talking about the same thing, what we're talking about is 10 years ago, most actors working in television, if you were, let's say, a series regular on a television series, you were shooting maybe 22, 23, 24 episodes a season. And those seasons would last most of a year. And then you'd have maybe a month or two off, and then you'd start in again for the next season. Now with streaming, most of those series are 8 to 10 episodes, and the gap between seasons is as long as 24 months. And bear in mind that actors working on those types of shows, they get paid per episode, not per day or per week. So what that really means is instead of getting paid 23 times your episodic rate every year, you're now getting paid, say, maybe 8 or 10 times your episodic rate every 2 to 3 years. That is a huge problem. And we even had people who are the star of a streaming series who lost their health insurance because they didn't have enough earnings between seasons of the show because they had a contract that said they couldn't do anything else, right? So you can imagine the squeeze from all sides. You're not allowed to do any other project, but you're not getting paid by this project. And you can't even get health insurance, and in this particular performer's case, was having their house foreclosed on. So, this was a situation that just could not be allowed to continue. So that was a huge fight as well. And then the third thing of the biggest 3 issues was recognizing the impact that inflation has had on people. When we started out that negotiation, the companies wanted our members to work for less money in 2023 and 24 than they made in 2020 in real dollar terms. And, obviously, we were not prepared to see people slide backwards. These are companies that can afford to compensate their talent, and they should. And certainly keeping up with inflation is not too much to ask. So those were the 3 big fights that were part of this negotiation. There were a lot of other things too. So by leaving things out, I'm not meaning to diminish any of the other things, because there are a lot of other really important things like some equity and inclusion things, casting, other things that are very specific. But in terms of the big issues, those were the ones that we were most talking about publicly during the strike.
So take us inside the negotiating room to the extent that you're able to, specifically on the AI issue, which is the topic of this panel. It seemed like, I don't want to assume anything. What were the CEOs of the streamers and the studios expectations around the AI issue at the beginning, and how did that change over time, and sort of how did you react to that dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they thought that they were going to be able to get through this cycle without making any substantial agreement on AI. And I think, unfortunately, that vision was bolstered by the fact that earlier bargaining in that same cycle by other unions had happened without proposals being made on AI even in the first round. So I think they kind of thought they were going to push back and we would eventually back off on AI, and then they would get to wait 2 or 3 years before deciding how to address AI with the unions. But from my point of view, we've been working on AI and SAG-AFTRA for a number of years. We had a panel track at CES in January of last year, well before bargaining started, called Future Shock, and it was a whole panel track about the impact of AI on Hollywood. It was clear to me that we could not wait, even beyond this specific round of bargaining, to establish substantial protection. So we went in with detailed proposals in our proposal package on June 7th, and I think that took them a bit by surprise. And I really think that there was doubt that we would be willing to go on strike over this issue. But there was no doubt in our membership, and I'm not quite sure how the industry didn't really read the tea leaves.
Yeah.
Because we came into that negotiation with a strike authorization already in hand. And that's an unprecedented step right there. That strike authorization had a 98% yes vote from our membership. It had the highest turnout in that vote of any vote we've taken in decades. Almost 50% of our members actually voted in that vote. I mean, compare that to the percent of our population that votes in the presidential election even. That's a lot. Yeah. And so I told them on the very first day of bargaining across the table, I said to them, do not underestimate our resolve. I said those exact words. If we do not resolve this, there will be a strike. And I reminded them of that repeatedly during that time, but yet it just didn't achieve the result that was needed. And so ultimately, as you know, we did extend our negotiating period by 12 days. We've never done that before. We did that because we were getting signals from the companies that maybe they were getting prepared to make some moves. That didn't materialize. And then at the end of that 12-day extension, on July 14th, we went on strike.
So I'd love to hear about the membership and kind of how they were thinking about this. When the agreement went to vote, it was ratified by, correct me if I'm wrong on this, I believe 80% to 20%, right? Yep. So you had members who just were like, we got to ban AI. We can't, it's impossible. We'll all lose our jobs. No AI, that's our position. I'm curious to hear you talk about how you navigate a membership body with diverse opinions on this particular issue, and just more broadly, a membership body that is very diverse socioeconomically. You've got very, very wealthy members, and you've got members, most members, if I believe is correct, who make less than $20,000 a year as working in Hollywood in the roles that relate to the union. So how did you navigate your own membership's expectations, particularly the people that were super hardline on AI?
Yeah, I understand it. I get why people want us to ban AI. Totally, that makes perfect sense. There is a contingent of our members who feel like that would be the best strategy. From my point of view, it really isn't about whether you think we should or shouldn't have AI, because the fact of the matter is we're going to have AI. And if we had strategically said we're going to take all of our firepower, all of our leverage, and we're going to use it to try and ban AI, we would not have succeeded. We can't do that. Any more than any union ever in history has been able to stop technology. Unions that try that approach, what ends up happening is they fail, and they give up the opportunity to influence how those technologies are implemented. So we made a very conscious, strategic decision that I know some of our members don't agree with, but the vast majority do, to use the power and leverage we have to establish guardrails and to help make sure that the implementation of AI is human-centered and focused on augmentation of human capability and not replacement of people. And so that's what we're really all about, making sure that AI is implemented in a fair and responsible and ethical manner. And there will always be people who don't agree with that, and that's fine. That's one of the beauties of a union is it's a democracy. It's actually, unions are one of the most firmly regulated democratic institutions in our country. In our union, we have elections every 2 years. and the folks who are in charge of making those decisions, our board, our president, Fran Drescher, and others, they're accountable to the members. And so I was quite confident that the vast majority of the membership would vote in favor of this agreement. And I went out and met with a lot of them in person. I did a whole, went around the country talking to our members during the ratification process. And I was confident that they would vote in favor of it. But that's not to diminish the really strongly held views of people who think AI should be banned. But that's fine for them to go advocate for that. That's great. But I think as an institution, we have to use the power we have to make sure this is done as in the most ethical, effective way possible.
Right. I mean, there's the kind of ethical and moral argument, but then there's the tactical argument and the strategic argument that you're dealing with when you're out there in the real world, negotiating with people who also have a lot of will and a lot of desire to get their way. And
I mean, it's like someone said to me, we were discussing this, and someone said to me, this is collective bargaining and negotiation, not a shopping spree.
Right.
We don't just get to go in and dictate terms.
Right.
We are literally fighting a existential battle with some of the biggest, most powerful companies in the world who actually own the media.
Yeah.
And yet, because of, this is the first time we've had a big strike where social media has been present. We'll probably imagine we might talk about this more, but these companies literally own so much of the media landscape, and yet we were able to deliver the message we were communicating to the public because it really resonated in a way that I think was much more in line with how the public feels and is concerned than the corporate line on this.
I'm glad you said that, because I want to do one more question on kind of the recent past that led to the agreement before moving into lots of sort of specifics about what's already happening, what's coming down the pike, how you're planning for it. And by the way, there'll be an opportunity for everyone to ask questions in the last 15, 20 minutes of the session. But that's such a good point about how AI is this thing that during the timing of your negotiation was on the minds of so many people. So many people were worried about its effect on their jobs. How much do you think that related to the public's, I don't know if side taking is the word, but sort of attitude towards the two sides of your negotiation?
Oh, I think it was crucial to it. And it's interesting because they did some polling. I forget which polling outfit did it, but an entity did some polling. And the level of support among people who do not normally support unions, but for this specific strike, was extraordinary. It was like 20% higher. It was quite substantially higher among people who don't normally support unions or necessarily even strikes. And I think it's for that reason. And also I think there is a certain sentiment that corporate power has just gotten out of whack. And I think even people who may or may not love unions or love these approaches say it is long past time for somebody to stand up to these big companies and say, let's think about what's happening, because AI isn't implementing itself. Humans are deciding what AI is going to be implemented and how, and let's hold humans who make those decisions responsible for the decisions they're making. It's, I think, a compelling statement, and for the general public, I think it really resonates, because sometimes it feels like that there's not enough inclusion of the public and of other considerations in how this stuff happens.
So let's move into the future, the very near future, and the more distant future. There is unbelievable anxiety in Hollywood in particular about the potential for these technologies to not just erode the status quo or the way things have always been done, but completely eliminate them or effectively eliminate them. I mean, just in the past couple weeks, you've had Tyler Perry, when he saw Sora, he said, "Oh, I might stop production on the $800 million studio I'm building in the Atlanta area because this thing can just do all that itself." Jeffrey Katzenberg said something like, 90% of animation jobs are going to be obsolete in the next 3 years based on the evolution of this. There's terror about ChatGPT and other, kind of LLM-driven software to write scripts, particularly in, like, say, genres like Christmas movies or movies that are maybe not the most that are formulaic and that that perhaps lend themselves more immediately to being written by computers. So let's start though with the kind of, I think what you would agree is maybe the most pressing immediate part of this, because it is much easier to do than some of those other examples I just cited, and that is voice acting. So tell me where you stand on this, and you could, in the process of answering that question, perhaps talk about some of the work that you've been doing as far as guarding actors' voices when they can be fairly easily replicated by AI.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right about that, Brendan. The voice actors are on the tip of the spear of this issue because, technically speaking, it's just the technology is there sooner when it only is voice as opposed to audiovisual. Although, I mean, as you could see from that video we started with, the audiovisual technology is not that far off. But for voice actors, it is a real concern. The potential replacement of those actors with synthetic voices, for example. And so what we've been doing is really working to make sure that the major companies who work in this space are committed to, A, using replication in a responsible manner. We have provisions about that in the contract that we were on strike for last year. We just finished negotiating our television animation agreement, which is a separate agreement that covers specifically animated TV projects. That's actually out for ratification right now. And in those agreements, number one, there are specific provisions that prevent companies from replicating performers' voices without their consent. That consent has to be fully informed consent, where the intended uses are put forward and can be signed off yes or no by the performers. And there has to be fair compensation for any of that kind of replication. Then we can move to the second issue, which you're sort of hinting at, which is the concept of synthetic voices, the concept of training a generative AI model that then can generate a voice performance that doesn't replicate any actual human, but is made up of the result of that AI's output based on everything it's been trained on. And I think there's a lot of issues there. Now, in terms of the protections we are looking at, I think our focus in that area is making sure that there's not an economic incentive for companies to go down that road. And so in our TV and film agreement, we have, and also in our TV animation agreement, we have provisions that require companies that make that type of synthetic performance to notify us of their fact that they're doing so and negotiate with us over the economics of that. And that's our goal, is to at least tamp down economic incentives to do that, so that human performers are not on, or that there's a level playing field and not, financial benefit from just ditching the human performance. I really believe that there's a lot to be said for human creativity. And, having done quite a bit of experimenting with ChatGPT myself and with some of the other AI tools, it's not quite, you're not going to, if you think about, let's say, the films that are nominated for Oscars, those are not films that are going to be generated by ChatGPT.
Right.
But to your point, more routine content that's generated, I think that is an area of risk, and it's really unclear how much of that the studios or other companies are going to do. Last thing I would say about that is, I do think people overestimate the speed at which these technologies will be implemented in the industry. One of our panels last year at CES, there was a futurist, a sort of AI futurist, who predicted that every project in Hollywood would be driven by AI within 6 months. Obviously, that didn't happen, and nor will it happen, I think, because we have to remember, AI is not free either. Like, implementing these technologies comes at a cost. It requires changes to business processes that have been long established. And the fact is, if anyone who's ever worked in the film or television industry knows, when you make big changes to these processes, things get messed up, and that has its own cost. So I'm not saying it won't get there. It probably will get there at some point. But I think what the industry is focused on now, and this is certainly what we discovered during our negotiation process with them, is the use of replication to actually streamline the production process more so than the use of full synthesis to replace performers. And so I think during this term of the agreements, this next 2.5 years, our main focus needs to be on making sure that replication only happens with informed consent and with fair compensation, and also continuing to fight a longer term battle about the future of human creativity. Last thing I'll just say on this is, one of the things that's so important is the position the U.S. Copyright Office has taken on copyrightability of AI-generated works. And thankfully, their position is that if you have a work that is primarily generated with AI, it's not eligible for copyright registration or copyright protection. And they base this view both on the Copyright Act, but also on the constitutional provisions relating to copyright. And that view has been upheld already by one of the Federal Circuit Courts of Appeal. So I think that is very promising. My conversations with copyright authorities around the world is that is the definite trend in other countries as well. And I think that's so important because that underlines the idea that copyright is for human creativity and human artistry. And that's going to help make sure that these businesses that rely on the exclusive rights to their content need to rely on human creativity. And I've said this to not only the studios and streamers, but I've said it to the record labels, the video game companies. What is unique about these companies is actually their relationship to creative talent.
Yep.
If that is what makes them different than any AI startup out there. And it is at their own peril that they forget that. Because if they decide to just achieve a lowest common denominator, then anyone can do what they do. And is that really where you want to be? If you are the CEO of a studio, a streamer, a video game company, a record label, do you want to be in just level playing field competition with OpenAI or any of the others?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. Human creative talent is what makes things unique, and that's the connection. Sorry, the last thing I'll just say about that, no, that was supposed to be the last thing, but one more thing I'll just say is...
That was the second to last thing.
I know,
I
can't stop, but we talked about this, Brendan, which is that if you remember last year when we started our strike, there was a whole slate of big budget movies that were supposed to be released in the fall of last year. And they were done. They didn't need any more acting work. There was nothing else that had to be done to release those movies but release them.
Yep.
And yet they didn't. After Barbie and Oppenheimer, poof, it stopped, right? Why? The reason why is because none of our members would go out and promote those movies. They wouldn't go to red carpet events. They wouldn't go out and do fan engagements. They wouldn't get on social media. None of it because of our strike rules, right? But what I think is more important about that is the point that a big part of success in this industry is connecting with the audience. And so my question to them and to you and to everybody is, so you've got some project that you've made with AI, with a synthetic performer. How is that synthetic performer going to go walk a red carpet? How is that synthetic performer going to connect with an audience and make them want to go see that specific thing?
Yep.
I think that's a real question. And it's not that there aren't tricks to work around it or other things that you can do, but the fact is there's a reason why huge movies were pulled from the schedule, and it was because they would not be as successful without the connection between those artists, their fans, and the folks that these companies want to engage with.
Yeah, so a lot there for sure. I want to go back to a couple things. Yeah, totally agree. It's hard to imagine an AI-generated live-action movie with any kind of artistic ambition. Maybe it comes along with commercial ambition as well, that the general public is going to be like, yeah, I'm really dying to go see that live action movie with people that aren't real about stories that was generated by machines. Easier to imagine, I think, with animation, easier to imagine with some of those kind of genre films I mentioned. That just feels a little bit more like something that you could see happening. And also totally agree, like with the publicity campaign. I mean, I think Dune Part 2 was one of those that was done and they could have released and just waited probably for the reason that you cite. I want to go back though to the voice replication. Do you envision a future where often you go to like an Illumination film or a Pixar film, you take your kids to see it or whatever, and you just see like this long list of very, very famous actors whose voices are in that movie. Half the time you don't even know it's that person. Sometimes you might recognize the voice, sometimes not. Can those people, in the way things are moving, do you see it being preferable for those actors to sign just replication deals to allow all of the voicing to be done that way, saving them time? Maybe they even take a little bit less money because they have to do less work. Like, where do you see that going?
I think for some actors, they may want to do that. It may work for them for various reasons, schedule or other things. And I think from our point of view institutionally, we're all about empowering those actors to either say yes or no to that. I also do think, you probably noticed this, when you go see one of those animated projects, particularly that has a high-profile cast, you probably notice that the animated characters resemble
Yeah.
a lot of times in certain key features they'll resemble the cast who are doing
Sometimes,
the
yeah.
voices,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so, the way that's typically done is by animators using either traditional tools or even potentially some AI tools are actually watching a recorded, the recording process of the voice acting and then using cues from that to help their animation. So I'm not sure that the animation companies will actually want digital replication for that purpose, because I think they will be worried they're going to lose something from the animation process. But I mean, that remains to be seen. The bottom line for us is those actors should have the ability to say yes or no to having their voices replicated. They now clearly have that right established under our contracts, and I'm sure they will exercise that right. I mean, just bear in mind, before last November, there was nothing in our contracts or anyone else's that gave them a right to say yes or no to that. And now they clearly do have that right. So, is this issue solved? No. This is an evolutionary process, but going from zero rights to substantial consent rights, I think, is the most important first step in dealing with that stuff.
Yep. Let's talk about Sora. Sora, for those that don't know, was released by, I don't think it was actually officially released.
Yeah,
I forget what
yet.
term they used, but OpenAI put out a version that people could play with. It created, I think the cap was 1 minute videos that could be generated by a prompt. I'll start with a question. Were you surprised by the quality that Sora could turn out?
I mean, I think we've been expecting it, and it doesn't surprise me that OpenAI would be the first out with something like that. I do think it is not at all clear that Sora has the capability to generate a convincing human performance, as distinguished from like landscape scenes or other simpler things to do. But I think it just highlights why this issue is so important for us to fight over now, because there were people who were arguing, oh, wait and see where this goes. Maybe this isn't going to go in that direction. I don't think you could do that. You need the guardrails up as the technology develops. Otherwise, it just gets out of control, and it's too much of the genie out of the bottle. So, so it doesn't surprise me. It does concern me. I also think it raises the question that we are sort of socially answering, but we haven't answered it yet, which is how do we feel as a society about the idea that companies like OpenAI can just go out and sort of take creative content created by other people and use it to train an AI model that they then turn around and monetize and create as a product without getting anyone's consent, without paying anyone for the inputs that they've used to create this result. And there are copyright lawsuits working through the system now about, is that a copyright infringement or not? Certainly our view is it is, and that companies that are building AI models ought to only be doing that with inputs that have been consented to or licensed, and where the creators who actually made this stuff that these AI systems are now built on are fairly compensated for the work that they did that's actually now facilitating what these AI tools are doing. So I certainly hope that's how those cases come out, and if they don't, I think we'll have another debate to be had about whether that needs to be remedied, through new laws or through other methods.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I work in the media industry, which is, dealing with similar issues and similar existential threats. OpenAI has done some deals with Axel Springer and the AP to pay to train their models on that information. It's uneven. The concept of what's right and ethical is being unevenly applied across industries, and there's so much that needs to get resolved there in the interest of kind of fairness and building a business that is sustainable economically for all. And it will be fascinating to see how this unfolds.
It's uneven, and it's also, to be honest, it's hypocritical. Because has OpenAI publicly released their algorithms and their models? Are they making their databases and APIs for free available to everyone? No, right? So how come it's okay to basically take the creative work and output of everybody else to build your model, but then you decide that you should wall it off and charge people for it? I mean, this is the kind of thing that always troubles me, where you have big companies, big tech companies in particular, who on the one hand are advocating a free and open internet, meaning they should be able to scrape whatever they want out of the world and use it to build their stuff. But then when it becomes their content now, because they've done that, all of a sudden now they are huge advocates for copyright and everything else. You know, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and in this case, it is really bizarre that these companies do not see the hypocrisy in that position.
Yep. Well, and we could have a whole conversation about OpenAI. Sam Altman's back on the board, that great crusader for righteousness. Elon Musk is suing OpenAI for some of the reasons that you just cited, so that's a whole nother conversation. Let's go back to the video game industry and your membership, because there's a lot happening there. You already talked about Replica Studios a little bit, and the agreement that you worked out with them, which if you could briefly summarize, I know that you were pretty satisfied with that, and how that affects the kind of potential for a strike against the video game companies in the future.
Yeah, we reached an agreement with Replica Studios. It's an Australia-based company that is focused on creating digital voice replicas of performers for use specifically in the video game industry. And we've been working for a while, actually for quite a while, with them on an agreement which we announced in January at CES. And I think this agreement is really groundbreaking for a number of reasons, but probably the most important part is it is the next evolution of protections for performers in this area, including things like making sure there are detailed rules about safe storage of digital replica data, including things like putting time limits on how long you can use replicas without getting fresh consent, and including agreements about the appropriate consent and compensation for including people's image, likeness, voice, and work and performances in foundational AI models that are used to build these AI tools. So I really feel like this is a huge step forward, considering it was 2 months after we reached the deal with the studios and streamers that we announced this agreement. And I think it's really, I will just say that Replica is a great example of a company that came to this discussion wanting to do the right thing. Now, that doesn't mean we always agree about what the right thing is. Obviously, we may have differences of views on that. And there are others. But I really feel like that is a great place to be in working on these issues, is when you have companies whose leadership get it, that talent and creative talent are concerned about how the things they're doing really affect everyone. And that is not the case with everybody. I was at the World Economic Forum in Davos earlier this year, and I was one of only a few labor people who were at this event. Tons of tech industry people there talking about AI, and so excited about it. And I understand why they're so excited about it. I get it, and in most cases, it's not even malicious. It's just there is no recognition of the impact of what they're doing on people outside of their own world. And I think it's important that there be people, and I'm happy to be one of them, but there may be a lot more than me, reminding them and pushing on this issue of understand the impact of what you're doing on human beings and take that into account. That part of that dialogue. And so Replica is a great example of that. And I think the work we did there is playing a part in our video game negotiations. We are currently in bargaining with all the major game studios. The biggest sticking point, I'll give you one guess what it is. It's AI, spoiler alert. We have a strike authorization in that contract, and it is, at this point, at least 50-50, if not more likely than that we end up going on strike against all the major video game companies in the next 4 to 6 weeks, because of the inability to get past these basic AI issues. And I really hope that we are able to avoid that. We don't want to go on strike. Going on strike is the last resort, but we are not going to make deals with these companies that do not protect our members from abusive and exploitative uses of AI.
Is there any reason that the video game companies would doubt your seriousness in light of the same threat that you made to the Hollywood system, and that they called your bluff and it didn't work?
No, I don't think they doubt our seriousness, but I think the dynamics are a little different in the video game industry, The role of performers in video game development is a little different than it is in film and television projects. Obviously, most games have a lengthy development period, and most of that period is made up of the actual, coding and development process more so than the performance process.
Right.
But also, I think that there are some things that we need in the video game world that are a little different because of the way video games are created. And so, for example, there are a lot of creature performers in video games, meaning performers who don't ever speak a line,
right,
but create a very specific performance as part of that video game. And anyone out here who's a gamer, I'm sure can immediately think of examples of that, like I can. And so that requires some special provisions that are a little bit different than what's in the film and television agreement. So the film and television agreement has helped. The strike certainly, I think, demonstrated our seriousness. But I don't know if we'll be able to get this across the line without having to do it again. Hopefully we won't.
Okay, just a couple more, because I do want to leave time for questions. One of the things you negotiated into the agreement in Hollywood was the right to basically check in with the I always get that hard, AMPTP members, to see what progress they're making, what they're working on. If you could just quickly describe sort of the thinking behind that bullet point and what you expect to see at your first 6-month check-in, which is, I believe, in June.
Yeah, no, the thinking behind that was one of the things we need to know is where the companies are going before they get there. And so part of that, and this is especially true for generative AI, because I think that is yet to be determined. And so having the right to meet with them every 6 months and get a download on what they're up to with respect to AI in general and generative AI in particular is crucial for us in planning for our next round of bargaining in 2.5 years. Also, I do want to mention one of the things that we've been really concerned about, in particular with generative AI, is the fact that when you train an AI model like that, you are training it typically with the past, right? You're training it with all kinds of stuff from the past. And we're very concerned, especially in models that are used for decision making or recommending, things like casting, that we not encode the biases of the past into these systems. And so one of the things that's specifically part of that provision is that we will be discussing the steps that the companies are taking to ensure that any kind of AI systems they're developing like that take appropriate inclusion and equity considerations into account and don't encode past biases into the system. But if I can't, sorry, just one other thing I wanted to say about that, the video game thing is that I forgot to mention. We just recently released a new set of tiered interactive media agreements that are designed for lower budget games for indie devs and studios. And those agreements have already gotten a very good reception from the indie game development community, and they contain exactly what we're looking for from the major game studios. And the point I'm making there is just to say, just like last year when we had an interim agreement that had the stuff that we needed in it, and over 1,200 independent production companies signed that agreement. We've got indie game developers also signing the agreement. So when you think about what these big companies are doing, Replica Studios, all these indie games, they're all saying we can work with this. The only people who are saying we can't work with this are the big game companies. Why? Because they aren't willing to get to where, at this moment, to get where we need to be, to just treat people fairly as it relates to AI. They absolutely can do it. It's just like what we said to the studios last year. For so long, they said, we can't do this, we can't do this, we can't do this. Then they did it. Has the world fallen apart? No, because it's actually a very reasonable way to approach taking care of people. And we just need more corporate interests to recognize that.
Thank you, Duncan. Thanks, everybody, for coming.